In June of 1970, in the Azteca Stadium in Mexico City, the Brazilian national football team played the final of the World Cup against Italy. By the time the match ended, Brazil had won 4-1. They had scored 19 goals in 6 games across the entire tournament. They had not lost a single match. And the fourth goal, scored in the final minutes with the game already won, is still described more than 50 years later by many football historians as the single most beautiful goal ever scored in a World Cup. The move involved 12 passes. It started with a defender casually dribbling past 4 Italian players in his own half, just to entertain himself. The ball went left, then right, then back, weaving through the team until it reached Pelé on the edge of the penalty area. Pelé didn't shoot, he waited. He saw his captain, Carlos Alberto, sprinting from the right side of the field and laid the ball into his path without even looking. Carlos Alberto hit it at full speed. It flew into the corner of the net like a rocket. Eric Cantona, one of the most celebrated players in football history, once said about that goal, "I refuse to accept that Carlos Alberto's goal was any less beautiful than the poetry of the young Rimbaud." A football goal compared to French poetry. That is the kind of thing Brazil does to people. So, how did they get there? How did a country that didn't know what a football was in 1894 become, in the opinion of most of the world, the greatest footballing nation that has ever existed? The answer involves a suitcase, a street game, and a man born with legs that curved in opposite directions. Football came to Brazil in 1894, inside a suitcase. The man carrying it was Charles William Miller. He was 20 years old, born in Sao Paulo, to a Scottish father and a Brazilian mother of English descent. At age 10, he had been sent to England for his education, and there he discovered football. He played for his school team, then for the Corinthian Football Club, one of the most celebrated amateur clubs in England at the time, and eventually for St. Mary's, a club that would later become Southampton Football Club. In 1894, Miller returned to Brazil. In his suitcase, 2 footballs, a rule book from the Hampshire Football Association, and an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. When his father met him at the dockside in Sao Paulo and asked what he had in the bag, Charles Miller replied, "My degree." Then he handed his father a letter from the headmaster that read, "Your son has graduated in football." Brazil at that time had no idea what football was. The expatriate British community in Sao Paulo had kept many customs from home, cricket on Saturdays, afternoon tea, but not football. So Miller taught it. He organized the first match in the country. He founded the first football league in Brazil, the Liga Paulista. He played striker, and his team, the Sao Paulo Athletic Club, won the first 3 league championships in 1902, 1903, and 1904. By 1910, just 16 years after Miller arrived with his suitcase, football had become the most popular sport in Brazil. But the game that arrived in 1894 looked almost nothing like the game Brazil would become famous for, because when football first came to Brazil, it belonged to a very specific group of people. In its earliest years in Brazil, football was a sport of the wealthy. The clubs that formed in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro were made up almost entirely of elite Brazilians and British expatriates. It was organized, disciplined, and played by the rules, a very British version of the game. Rigid, structured, tactical. The working class watched from the outside. But football is not a sport that stays inside walls. It spills onto streets and beaches and open fields. And as it spread beyond the elite clubs, something began to happen to it. The people playing it on the streets, with no coaches, no formal training, no rule books, started to play it differently. On the streets of Rio de Janeiro, on the beaches of Sao Paulo, in the open fields of small towns across the country, children played football the way they played everything else, with improvisation, with creativity, with an emphasis on making the ball do things that hadn't been done before. Football in Brazil merged with the culture around it, with the rhythms of samba, with the movements of capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art that turns combat into dance. The result was a style of play unlike anything Europe had produced. Where European football prized organization and physical strength, the street game that developed in Brazil prized skill and flair. Where European defenders were trained to stop attacking moves, Brazilian players were inventing moves that couldn't be predicted or stopped because they had never been seen before. By the 1940s and 1950s, Brazil had developed the 4-2-4 formation, a tactical system built around two wide attackers operating with complete creative freedom. Where European teams of the era still structured their attacks around rigid patterns, Brazilian football gave its players a framework and then told them to fill it however they wanted. One journalist captured the difference perfectly when he wrote, "Brazilian football is a thing played to music." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. In 1958, Brazil won their first World Cup. The tournament was held in Sweden. Brazil arrived as a strong team, but not as the runaway favorites. What happened over those 3 weeks changed the global perception of what football could be. The players who defined that tournament came directly from the street game, not the elite clubs, not organized academies, the streets. Pelé was 17 years old, born Edson Arantes do Nascimento in the small city of Tres Corazones, which translates beautifully as 3 hearts. He grew up in poverty, playing football with a sock stuffed with rags because his family couldn't afford a proper ball. He made his debut for the Brazilian national team at 16. At 17, at the World Cup in Sweden, he became the youngest player ever to score in a World Cup final. In the semifinal against France, he scored a hat trick. He wept after the final whistle, tears of joy, at 17, already a world champion. But the player the Brazilians themselves celebrated most from that tournament was not Pelé. It was Garrincha. Manuel Francisco dos Santos was born in 1933 in a small factory town called Pau Grande, near Rio de Janeiro. He was the grandson of slaves. His father was an alcoholic. He was born with a deformed spine and his legs curved in opposite directions, his left bending outward, his right bending inward. He was small, and his sister, seeing how he moved, nicknamed him after a small, ungainly bird, Garrincha, the Portuguese word for wren. When he joined Botafogo Football Club at 19, the club doctor examined him and filed a report recommending they not sign him. The medical verdict? Physically unfit to play professional football. Garrincha played professional football for the next 20 years. On his debut for Botafogo, he scored a hat trick. His dribbling, developed entirely on the streets and fields of Pau Grande without any formal coaching, was unlike anything defenders had seen. He would approach a man at full speed, stop dead, shimmy left, then right, then left again, and by the time the defender had decided which direction to commit to, Garrincha and the ball were already past him. At the 1958 World Cup in Chile, Pelé was injured after the second game and played no further part. Garrincha essentially carried the entire team on his crooked legs. He scored 4 goals. He was named the tournament's best player, its top scorer, and won the Golden Ball, the only player in history to win all 3 individual awards in a single World Cup. Brazil won their second title in a row. Garrincha never lost a single match while wearing the Brazil shirt. In every international match he played from start to finish, Brazil won. Not some of them, all of them. He died in 1983 at 49 years old. His body, as the doctors had predicted in 1952, had not been built to last. His funeral procession from the Maracanã Stadium in Rio back to Pau Grande drew thousands of mourners lining the streets. He had grown up with nothing. He left as one of the most loved figures in the history of a country that treats football like religion. If 1958 was the emergence of Brazilian football and 1962 was its confirmation, then 1970 was its absolute peak. The 1970 Brazil squad is the team that football historians point to when someone asks, "What is the best football team ever assembled?" It is not a unanimous verdict, nothing in football ever is, but it is the most common answer. The team was built around Pelé, now 29, and at the absolute height of his powers. He had scored his 1,000th career goal the previous year in front of 80,000 people at the Maracana. Alongside him was Jairson, known as the Hurricane, who scored in every single game of the tournament. That had never been done before in a World Cup. It has not been done since. There was Rivelino, with a left foot so technically devastating that a young Diego Maradona, watching in Argentina, later said Rivelino was the player he idolized growing up. There was Tostón, Gerson, and the captain, Carlos Alberto, a right back who played with the creativity of a midfielder and finished the tournament with the goal we described at the start of this video. Brazil scored 19 goals in 6 games in the 1970 World Cup. They won the Jules Rimet Trophy outright. Under FIFA rules at the time, any nation that won the World Cup 3 times kept the trophy permanently. Brazil took it home to Rio. They earned it. The phrase Jogo Bonito, the beautiful game, is most associated with Pelé, who popularized it in the late 1970s and used it as the title of his autobiography. But its origins go deeper. The phrase was first associated with Didi, the midfielder who was the creative engine of the 1958 World Cup team. It described not just a way of playing, but a philosophy, that football should be played with creativity and joy as primary values, that the manner of victory mattered as much as the victory itself. Jogo Bonito was not invented in a coaching manual or a tactical meeting room. It grew from the same place Garrincha grew, from streets and fields and beaches where children played without instruction, developing skills that had no names because no formal system had produced them. Many historians argue that the style was shaped by ginga, a blend of Afro-Brazilian art forms, including samba and capoeira, where values like acrobatics and the expression of joy through movement are central. When those cultural values merged with a competitive sport, they produced something the European game had never seen and has spent the decades since trying to imitate. Every major footballing nation in the world has, at some point, sent coaches to Brazil to study how they produce players. The Dutch total football of the 1970s was directly influenced by Brazilian ideas about creative freedom within structure. The Spanish tiki-taka, the passing style that dominated world football from 2008 to 2012, drew heavily on Brazilian principles of technical excellence and fluid movement. Brazil changed how the entire world thinks about football, not through tactical manuals, through Garrincha playing on a dirt field in Pau Grande, through Charles Miller arriving at a dock in Sao Paulo with a suitcase and an obsession. Brazil has won 5 World Cups, more than any other nation in history. They've produced more players named to the all-time FIFA World 11 than any other country. Their national team's yellow shirt is arguably the most recognized sports jersey on Earth. And when you trace it all the way back, past the 1970 final, past Garrincha's crooked legs, past the streets of Rio, it leads to a 20-year-old man with 2 footballs in a suitcase stepping off a boat in Sao Paulo, asking his friends if they wanted to learn a new game. They did. Subscribe. Next week, the rules of football explained the way nobody explains them, through the stories of every single time they went catastrophically wrong. For new fans, this one is essential.